Hello Orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. Today in this video, we're going to look at this Phalaenopsis flying eagle Wilson. This is a cross between, I think, dragon tree eagle and Speciosa or Tetraspis C1. The biggest characteristic is that it would have random red and yellow color combination on the petals and sometimes sepals. So let's go back in time. So if we go back to summer 2018, that was after last blooming cycle ended, and I trim off all the dead dried spike, and that's what it looked like at the time. It was immediately starting to grow more roots and more leaf. And end of 2018 was when I first saw this orchid putting out its new spike. And obviously I was very excited. It really took about half year to turn around that, that cycle. And so beginning of 2019, end of January, the flower spike was in its full speed, and it was about, I'd say, early March 2019 that you could really see the buds forming. So this orchid, as I spotted the spike growing, I started to use a little bit more bloom booster and gradually phase out the nitrogen-based fertilizer. And it worked pretty well. And then I think coming up, it'll be probably around end of March 2019. That's when the first flower started to open. This orchid is relatively fragrant. I can detect its fragrance really easily from morning all the way to early afternoon. And the way that this orchid is growing, for example, its leaf growth and root growth, I think it's pretty happy in the semi-hydro setup. And I'll go into a little bit of that and how I care for it in the semi-hydro setup, especially how I control the water, because sometimes it may not need all the water that's required to fill up the entire reservoir, meaning it probably only needs less water, but I'll go into a little bit more detail later in the video. This orchid at one point was producing 2 spike. That was the blooming cycle from last year and the year before. So it has had 2 spikes at the same time before, but this time around it's just 1 spike. But I'm still pretty happy because even with just 1 spike, this orchid is a sequential bloomer, so during a bloom season, it could potentially elongate its spike further and give you more buds. This one right now is only giving me 2 flowers for this bloom cycle, but based on last year's experience, usually the spike will hold on for a little longer, and if the conditions are met, it will elongate and give you a little bit more flower for a bloom cycle. So we'll see if this is also the case for this year. In terms of care, this orchid still receives just quarter strength fertilizer throughout, and the only difference is that when I first saw the spike, like I said earlier, I was switched to bloom booster versus the nitrogen-based fertilizer. And this time around, you can see it's only the top right petal of the 2 flowers that have more significant difference. The one on the left have a little bit more yellow toward the tip of the petal, and the one on the right is almost red. So that's the difference this time around. But before, I have had completely yellow petal or sepal So it's random, and that's a characteristic of a Speciosa or Tetraspis orchid. I do also flush this orchid from time to time, typically once a month. It's grown in semi-hydro right now, but here is what I want to share with you about why I think this orchid may not necessarily need all the water that's required to fill up the reservoir, meaning it would only need less water than that. So this orchid originally had pretty good root system to begin with, and I knew this orchid will grow to be a larger size orchid versus my mini phal or medium phal. I know this one will eventually grow to a normal size Phalaenopsis orchid. So I actually use a 24-ounce cup, which is much bigger than most of my orchids container. So here you see this is the 24-ounce transparent container that I use, and the diameter is much bigger, and I already tried to drill the drainage hole as much close to the bottom as possible. At the time I thought that was good, but actually it's still higher than necessary, because if I fill up the reservoir, I noticed that this orchid, yes, it doesn't have root rot, but I noticed that it takes up to maybe 10 or 14 days for the container to become completely dry, and sometimes even longer if my humidity my area's humidity is higher. And to me, that's a little dangerous. It's not necessarily bad, but because also for convenience reason, I like to water most of my orchids in summertime once a week. And if this orchid only needs water every other week, so it would have a very different watering cycle, and I don't want to have too big of a difference, because sometimes it's just really hard to keep track of which orchid needs water. So I prefer to get them on the same watering cycle if possible. So I gradually reduced the amount, and then I kept trying, experimenting. I noticed that quarter cup of water pouring down to the container, that in my environment is usually very good for just about 7 days. Usually between the 5th and the 6th day, I noticed that there is just simply no condensation, and that's when I know that it's completely dry. And then I wait until the weekend, the 7th day for example, to give it water. So that's how I gauge how much water I could only use versus filling up the reservoir. And here you see there is a yellow leaf, and it took quite a few weeks for that leaf to turn completely yellow. So that to me is very slow speed, and that means that it's just a natural shedding of the orchid, natural leaf shedding. So it's nothing alarming. But if you have a leaf or 2 or 3 that are turning yellow in a matter of 2 to 3 days, then usually that is because you may have some kind of root rot issue that's causing this orchid to feel stressed. And that's the sign that you may have to take the orchid out of the pot to see what happened or what's happening. And here you can see root system is really good. Lots of roots are already at the bottom, and that's why quarter cup of water poured from top, and it will eventually get down to the bottom. And because I already have roots reaching the bottom, so it's enough for those roots to gradually pick up the quarter cup of water and distribute it to the entire orchid system. Now, the 2 leaves at the front are the newest 2 leaves, and they are much bigger than older leaves in the back. So that's a great sign. That means that this orchid is finally reaching its potential or maturity. It may continue to grow bigger, but once their leaf grow to the full length without getting bigger, and that's usually the sign that this orchid is completely mature and reaching its full size potential. I don't know whether this orchid will continue to grow. We'll have to see how the upcoming leaf would do. But right now, if you just look at its older leaves, you can tell it's quite a big size difference. Overall, I really enjoy this orchid. I think it's a rewarding orchid that doesn't require too much special care. It's not finicky at all, so I highly recommend getting one for yourself for your collection. This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!